Okay. Hi, my name's Taylor DeHoyas, and I chose to do my Lest We Forget project over Davy Crockett. I have always been super interested in knowing more about his life, more about what makes him who he is. So whenever this project came about, I decided what better time to learn than right now. So stick with me while we learn more about Davy Crockett. Okay. Hi, my name's Taylor DeHoyas, and I chose to do my Lest We Forget project over Davy Crockett. I have always been super interested in knowing more about his life, more about what makes him who he is. So whenever this project came about, I decided what better time to learn than right now. So stick with me while we learn more about Davy Crockett. So the autobiography that I actually ended up really learning the most about Davy Crockett was one that he actually wrote, which is called King of the Wild Frontier, an autobiography by Davy Crockett. I found this autobiography super helpful. It was actually a really interesting read. It wasn't really long, which typically makes me lose interest whenever I read autobiographies. This one was a really easy read. It kept it really short, to the point. Everything was just about how he grew up and what made him who he was, and the major events that happened in his life that kind of laid out who he ended up being as a man. And so I was really happy that I chose this autobiography. So in the autobiography, The Wild Frontier, David tells us that his father's name is John Crockett. He was of Irish descent, and he was either born in Ireland or on a passage from that country to America across the Atlantic. He was a farmer by profession, and he spent the early part of his life in the state of Pennsylvania. His mother's name was Rebecca Hawkins, and she was an American woman that was born in Maryland between York and Baltimore. Now, from what David can remember, his dad fought in the Revolutionary War. He fought in the Battle of Kings Mountain against the British and the Tories. They all together had 6 sons and 3 daughters. David was the fifth son and was born August 17th, 1786. So David's dad has always found himself caught up owing people debt here and there, and David, being the hard worker that he always was made to go and work off some of that debt for his dad. At one point, there was a Dutchman that his dad owed a debt to, and he said that he could use labor to pay off that debt. So John sent David to this Dutchman. A young boy, David, traveled on foot with a perfect stranger, and they ended up about 3 miles before the Natural Bridge. And he was getting paid $5 to $6 for his services. Luckily for him, this man was very nice and pleased with the work that David had done. But due to his age, he was very young to be away from home with strangers, so he wanted to make his way back home after he had done the work that he needed to do. So he found himself at a tavern and convinced this older gentleman, which we would find out was the name of Mr. Dunn. He told this man his situation and that he wanted to make his way back home. So the older gentleman told him that he was welcome to stay at his home that was 7 miles from there, and if David somehow could get to them before the next morning, that they would take him home. Now, whenever David had gotten to his home, he immediately saw that the horses needed tending to, and so he went straight to work. Mr. Dunn saw Davy doing all of this and was very pleased with his ambition and his work ethic. And in the autobiography, it states that he used many arguments to try and actually get David to stay there and work for him. Nonetheless, he still wanted to go home, so he left and continued on foot. Fortunately for him, he was picked up by a man who was on his way back from the market, and he kindly offered him a ride on his horse until he finally made his way back home. David remained with his father until the next fall, at which time his father took it into his own accord and stated that David needed to go to school. While he was in school, he ended up getting into an altercation with a boy at the school who was a great deal bigger than him. David decided that instead of continuing the fight with this boy in school, he would wait for him to be out of school, and he was going to hide behind the bushes and use salt and vinegar on him. So he did just that. He waited outside the bushes for this boy, and he then attacked him when he got close enough and made him cry and ran off. After David went home, he woke up the next morning and set off for school, except he didn't really go. He was way too scared to go back because he knew the principal was probably going to give him a lick. So instead, he just laid in the woods and chilled out, and he actually convinced his brothers not to tell his dad that he hadn't been going to school, and they agreed not to. He ended up keeping it hidden for about 4 days, but in the end, his dad ended up finding out, and he came after him hard. They raced each other about a mile, and his dad finally stopped chasing him, but David just kept running because he was so terrified for his dad to get a hold of him. So he ended up into an old friend's house by the name of Jesse Cheek. And Jesse was about to go on a drive, and David, way too scared of his dad at this time, convinced Jesse to let him go with him. They ended up traveling with each other for about 400 miles. Then Jesse gave him about $4 and left David there, and Jesse continued on his little adventure that he was on. So Crockett bought some provisions and continued on his way until he fell in with another wagoner, Adam Myers. Now, David was very, very fond of this man, who on many occasions actually tried to convince David to go back to his dad. But he was too scared of what his dad would do to him because of what happened at school. So after traveling about 2 days, David ran into his brother, who also tried to convince him to go back home, but it didn't work, so they ended up parting ways. It was really, really sad. David found himself in Jaredstown, where he began doing some labor for a man named John Gray. David and Adam remained good friends, and one day David got in his head to go off to London, and he wanted to take all this money that he had saved up from all the labors that he had been doing, and he wanted to just start a new life. Adam grew very angry and threatened to take him back to his parents. David wanted to run away, but Adam kept a very strong eye on him. After they continued to argue about David wanting to leave, finally it broke out into a heated argument, and David just decided that it was time to go home, so he once again set out on this endeavor alone and on foot. While on his endeavor, he found himself bound to a man named Elijah Griffith, who was a hatter, so the autobiography says. He agreed to work with him for 4 years, but he was actually only with him for about 18 months. And then Elijah found himself in too much debt, so he eventually had to let David go, and he ended up leaving the country. So finally, after all of this time, David Crockett, now almost 15 years old, went home. His sisters were so excited to see him. He was almost unrecognizable because he had grown so much. His father agreed to let him stay, and they all ate dinner together. He remained there for some time until his father told him that he owed a debt to a man named Abraham Wilson, and this debt ended up being $36. He needed him to go work for him, and after that debt was paid, he was going to be set free. He worked there for 6 months. He ended up giving his dad the papers that showed that he was a debt-free man of this person, and he continued his way to a Quaker by the name of John Kennedy. John told David that he also had a note on his father for $40 that he owed, and if he would just work for him for 6 months, he would clear his name. So he went straight to work. During this time, David decided that he wanted to go to school, and the Quaker had a married son who lived about 1.5 miles from them, and he had a school. He made an agreement with the Quaker to go to school 4 days a week and then work for him, the two, and he did this for about 6 months. So in all of this busy work that David Crockett is busy doing, trying to get his dad out of debt, trying to go to school, he kind of falls head over heels for John Quaker's niece. Yes, his niece. And she was, he said, the most beautiful thing that he had ever seen. But unfortunately, she was engaged at this time, but a short period after, she actually ended up calling it off. Now, at this point, David Crockett is about 18 years old, and he's planning on marrying this girl. Like, he has it in his head that this is the girl that he wants to marry. He even states in the book that he would be the happiest man in the created world or in the moon or anywhere else if he could just be her husband. Now, plot twist, come to find out she's a little bit of a playa, and she was actually kind of telling the same thing to a whole bunch of different guys. David Crockett ended up getting word from her sister that if he was to marry this woman, that she would hurt him and deceive him and be mischievous behind his back. So he ended up getting his heart broken by her and absolutely falling into like a depression about how his heart was just always going to be broken and his life was always going to be about misunderstanding and mistreatment and dishonesty. So it was his first sense of like true heartbreak. Okay, so a little bit of time goes by, and he finds himself at this party where a Dutch woman introduces him to a very beautiful woman, and they end up dancing and they have a good time. This Dutch woman jokingly calls David Crockett her son in law. He and this girl grew stronger and stronger feelings for each other, and he actually ended up winning her heart completely. About 2 weeks after this, there was a hunt with all the men in her family, and of course, David went. On this hunt trip, he had to convince the entire family why he was worthy and good enough to marry this woman. After arguments and arguments of how he wasn't good enough, he ended up winning and set out to let her meet his parents. So he won the opinion of her family and he was ready for her to meet his. After she met his parents, they eventually got married. And it says in the autobiography that somewhere between marrying her, going on this hunt with her family, that's whenever he truly, truly developed a passion for hunting, hunting elk, and really anything that he could hunt. He had a true passion for it, but he had this yearning and this longing to hunt for bears and to kill bears. That's what he wanted to kill the most was bears. Okay, so David was living just below Winchester when the Creek War commenced. The Creek Indians had commenced their open hostilities by a bloody butchery at Fort Mims. The militia began to ask for volunteers, and when the day came, he told his wife he wanted to go. She told him that if he was to go, she wasn't going to know anyone, and she would be all alone. And he told her, and I quote, this is straight from the biography, if every man would wait till his wife got willing for him to go to a war, then there would be no fighting. Then there would be no fighting done until we would all be killed in our own homes. So he set out to war. He volunteered for 60 days, and then after that, they thought their services would not be needed. And then a day or two after their 60 days, they met Mr. Jones. Major Gibson came and stated that he wanted more volunteers to go with him across the Tennessee River and into the Creek Nation to help track the movement of the Indians. He came and asked for two of his best men, and his captain, Mr. Jones, sent David as one of those two. Now, after David fought against the Indians, he then wanted to go to Pensacola because he wanted a taste of the British fighting, but his wife was again really unhappy with this decision. She wasn't wanting him to go fight in the wars. She didn't want him to be so far away from her. He stayed and fought beside many, many Indians and American men, but after a while, he was actually ready to be home. David continued at home working on his farm for about 2 years as the war was soon approaching an end. So, a little after he returned home and kind of got to his farm and decided that he was going to do that for a little bit, he wasn't in the middle of the war. His wife ended up dying. So, a little after his wife died, she left him with their three kids. One of those was an infant. He really didn't think that he wanted another wife, but the more that he realized that he couldn't do this on his own, he couldn't be a single dad, he couldn't be that widowed dad left to take care of his children. He had a neighbor in his neighborhood that was a widow that had lost her husband in the war. She had two children, and he ended up courting her and kind of sending her little messages, giving her little hints that he was interested. He knew that she understood his backstory. He understood her backstory. So they actually ended up getting married the following fall. So David found himself still craving adventure. So he set out for another rendezvous with three friends, Robinson, Frazier, and Rich. They set out to the Creek country crossing the Tennessee River. Now, Frazier turned out to hunt, but he was badly, badly bitten by a poisonous snake. So they left him and they kind of went on ahead without him. So Davy Crockett found himself very, very ill and weak, and he was actually unable to continue on this little adventure. He laid on the ground with his rifle in his hand, trying to gain courage to continue on. When two Indians found him, one of the Indians actually proposed to go with him, and he would carry his gun and he would completely help him continue what he needed to do. These two men helped him onto the road, and as soon as he got to the road, he saw a lot of his neighbors that had kind of heard about what he was doing, that he needed help, that he'd been sick, that he was on this rendezvous and he kind of couldn't get through it because he had gotten so sick. So these two men helped him find his neighbors, and he was finally able to get himself to a house. He nursed himself back to health. He set out on that next fall to try and find another place to live because the place that he was at just really didn't fit him. And so he went to a place called Shoal Creek, which is about 8 miles from where he was living originally. As soon as he got there, he grew sick again, and he was unable to really go any further. But it was kind of like a sign because he found himself really, really pleased with the place that he had actually found in Shoal Creek. So he eventually, that's where he stayed. He moved there. So David became determined to make another move, so he took his eldest son with him, and a man by the name of Abram Henry, and he cut out for the onions. They found themselves in a storm and ended up finding a house that they could get warm in, and the owner's name was Mr. Owens. As it began to storm over the next few days, David set out to hunt and provide meat for them since they were letting him stay. The river that was close by had grown so much due to the rain, so David had to truck through that in pursuit of elk. He actually ended up killing 6 elks that one day. David continued to hunt, but he still had this passion about killing bears. He went on many adventures and very, very dangerous ones to kill them. And in less than 1 year after his continued hunt, he actually ends up killing 105 bears. He then retreated to his home after that hunting season, feeling very pleased with himself and not knowing what he was going to do with his free time that he now had because he'd kind of already done all the hunting that he wanted to do after he killed so many bears. After he returned home, and as the next August was the congressional election in which he began to turn his attention to, it would then begin to be talk amongst most of the people that maybe he would have a little bit more persuasion in the political form. So that concludes my presentation over my lest we forget figure, Davy Crockett. I think that he is a monumental man in history. And I think it's really interesting because in this autobiography, nowhere did it talk about, his Alamo journey or even his adventure being a congressman or being a part of the House of Representatives. It all came down to what made him who he was, what made him the Spitfire, honorable, tall tale telling, just man with all the stories, man that everyone really enjoyed him to be. I think that he needs to remain in history. I think that he is a good historical, I don't want to say landmark, but that's kind of the only word that I can think of, this historical figure. I think that his stories are so amazing and they show his heroism and they show how just as a little boy, he was given all of these circumstances and all of these things that he had to overcome, and he just did it. He just worked hard for his family. He went through a lot of loss, he went through a lot of sadness, and he still kind of came up on top. So I'm super, super honored that I got the chance to do a project over David Crockett. I think that he's a wonderful leading example of what young boys should want to be.